Close your eyes. Imagine a house, a very large house. Not your house, and not quite a castle, but something in between. Stone walls, high ceilings, long corridors that seem to go on forever in the dark. Somewhere above you, in the upper floors, a family sleeps soundly in feather beds with heavy curtains drawn against the night. But down here below stairs, in the cold lower reaches of the house, someone is already awake. It is 4:30 in the morning, perhaps earlier. The year is somewhere between 1880 and 1910. The place is England, a country estate, or perhaps a tall terraced house in London, or a grand manor house in the shires where the fields go on as far as the eye can see. The family who owns this house has money. They have comfort. They have, in fact, everything they need because they have servants. Tonight, we are going to descend those back stairs. We are going to move quietly through the kitchens and the sculleries, the silver pantries and the servants' halls. We are going to spend a long, ordinary, exhausting day in the company of the men and women who kept Victorian England's great houses running. This is not a story of glamour. It is not a story of drama or scandal or intrigue. It is something far more interesting than that. It is a story of routine, of repetition, of the same tasks performed the same way, at the same hour, day after day after day. Of cold mornings and sore knees, of silver that must always shine and fires that must never go out, of an entire invisible world that existed solely to make another world appear effortless. Breathe slowly. Let your body relax. We are going below stairs. The first servant to rise each morning was almost always the same, the most junior housemaid. In most large Victorian households, this girl, for it was almost always a girl, often no more than 14 or 15 years old, when she first took the position, would set her own small alarm clock for between 4 and 5 in the morning. She slept in the attic, in a narrow room with a sloping ceiling and a single window that looked out over the rooftops or the stable yard. The room was cold in winter and stifling in summer. It contained a bed, a small chest, a washstand, and very little else. She would dress quickly in the dark. Her uniform was carefully laid out from the night, before a dark dress, a white apron, a white cap that tied under the chin. She was not to be seen by the family, not yet, not in the morning, not while there was work to do. The rules of the Victorian household were very clear on this point. The machinery of domestic service was meant to be invisible. The fires simply appeared. The floors simply gleamed. The silver simply shone. No one upstairs needed to think about how any of it happened. And so the housemaid moved through the house like a ghost. Her first task, every morning without exception, was the fires. In a large Victorian house, there might be 10, 12, perhaps 15 fireplaces that needed to be cleaned and relaid before the family woke. The drawing room, the dining room, the morning room, the library, the master's study, each bedroom, each sitting room. Every one of them required exactly the same procedure, performed in exactly the same order. She would kneel on a kneeling mat, a small square of carpet or leather that protected her dress, and begin with the cold ash. The fire from the previous evening would have gone out hours ago. The grate would be a gray, dusty heap of cinders and pale ash. She would carefully remove the cinders that could still be used. Economizing was important. Waste was a sin in the Victorian household, and set them aside in a metal pail. Then she would clear the ash, brushing it carefully so it did not puff into the room, staining the carpets or the upholstery. Then the grate itself needed cleaning. She would apply black lead, a substance made from graphite to the iron grate, and polish it until it shone. This took time. This took patience. This left her hands and forearms dark with graphite dust that would not fully wash away until her next bath, which was permitted once a week. Then came the laying of the new fire. Crumpled newspaper at the bottom. Small pieces of wood, arranged just so. Then coal. The larger pieces balanced carefully to allow air to circulate. A match, touched to the paper, and a moment of watching, making sure the flame took, making sure the wood caught, making sure the coal began to glow before she moved on to the next room. This process would take the better part of 2 to 3 hours, working quickly and quietly through the silent house. The family above slept through all of it. By the time the first person upstairs stirred and rang the bell, every fireplace in the house would already be warm and glowing, as though it had always been that way, as though warmth simply existed in this house by some natural law. While the fires were being laid, other preparations had also begun. In the kitchen, the cook or the kitchen maid would have started the kitchen, range a massive iron cooking stove that dominated the lower floor and needed to be stoked and heated well before any actual cooking could begin. Water would be heating for the family's morning washing. Kettles would be coming to the boil. The first preparations for breakfast, which might include kedgeree, deviled kidneys, boiled eggs, cold meats, and several varieties of toast for a wealthy family, were already underway. The house was waking up from the bottom, in the cold and the dark, before anyone upstairs had so much as opened their eyes. Before we go any further into the day, let us take a moment to understand the world we are moving through. Because the world below stairs was not a simple place. It had its own structure, its own rules, its own social order as rigid and as carefully observed as anything upstairs. Everyone had a title. Everyone had a rank. And that rank determined almost everything: where you sat at the servants' table, who you were allowed to speak to, what work you were expected to do, and how you were addressed. At the very top of the female servants' hierarchy stood the housekeeper. The housekeeper was, in many ways, the most powerful person in the house who was not a member of the family. She was typically a woman of middle age, rarely married. The title Mrs. was a courtesy given to housekeepers regardless of their marital status, a mark of respect for their position, and she had usually worked her way up through years of service to reach this level. She kept the household accounts. She managed the stores of food, linens, candles, cleaning supplies, and all other household goods, locking them away in a large bunch of keys that she carried constantly at her hip. She hired and fired the female servants. She managed disputes. She maintained standards. Her room, known as the housekeeper's room, was typically a comfortable sitting room where she could receive the upper servants and where she could retreat from the noise and bustle of the kitchens. She dined here with the butler, and the ladies made the upper servants, as they were known in a kind of private hierarchy. Within the hierarchy, served by the younger staff. The butler was the male equivalent of the housekeeper in terms of authority, though his domain was different. He managed the male servants, oversaw the dining room, controlled the wine cellar, and was responsible for the silver, that gleaming, precious, endlessly polished collection of plates and serving pieces that represented a significant portion of a wealthy family's material wealth. The butler's pantry was his kingdom, a small, secure room where the silver was kept locked away, where he slept adjacent to it, some nights to ensure its security. The butler presented a face of absolute calm and unruffled dignity to the world. He moved slowly, spoke rarely, and conveyed authority without ever raising his voice. He was the public face of the servants, the one who answered the front door, who announced visitors, who directed the footmen in their work. He was addressed simply as his surname Carson, Hudson, Bates, a mark of respect that placed him above the maids, who were always called by their first names regardless of their age. Below the housekeeper and butler came the lady's maid and the valet, personal servants to the mistress and master of the house respectively. These were positions of unusual intimacy and unusual trust. The lady's maid dressed her mistress each morning, helped her select and care for her wardrobe, accompanied her when she traveled, and was privy to all manner of personal details that the mistress would share with no one else. She occupied a curious social position, neither fully a servant nor anything approaching a companion, but something in between, bound by a relationship of professional intimacy that could last for decades. Then came the cook, technically below the housekeeper in rank, but in practice a law unto herself in her own domain. The kitchen was the cook's territory, and a good cook was a valuable and difficult person to replace. She might employ a kitchen maid and a scullery maid beneath her, directing their work with the authority of a general commanding troops. The footmen were the visible, public-facing male servants. They wore livery formal uniforms in the family's colors, often including powdered hair or wigs for grand occasions, and their height, appearance, and general presentation were important enough that job advertisements for footmen often specified minimum heights. They waited at table, carried coal and water, answered doors, and performed the many visible tasks of a working household. They were ranked first, second, and sometimes third footmen, each with slightly different duties. The housemaids similarly were ranked head housemaid, second housemaid, third, and so on in larger establishments. The ladies' and gentlemen's personal attendants aside, housemaids did the work of keeping the house clean, the perpetual, never-ending, quietly exhausting work that this narration is really about. And at the very bottom of the hierarchy, the scullery maid. If there is a single figure who represents the hardest, most invisible, most relentless labor of the Victorian household, it is the scullery maid. She was typically the youngest female servant, the lowest paid, the one given the work that no one else wanted. She washed the pots and pans, an endless, back-breaking task in an era before running hot water, when pots were blackened with soot from the open range and must be scrubbed clean with coarse salt and rough cloths. She cleaned the kitchen floor. She peeled the vegetables. She dealt with the waste. She worked from first light until well after dark, in the hottest, most humid, most unpleasant part of the house. This was the world below stairs. Each person in it had a place, a role, a set of tasks that defined their days, and each of those tasks was performed to a standard that would be checked, assessed, and repeated. Breathe slowly. The house is warm now. The fires are burning. Let us follow the morning into the full routine of the day. By 7 in the morning, the invisible machinery of the house was in full motion. In the butler's pantry, the silver had been brought out. This was the butler's most sacred duty, and his most time-consuming morning task, the care and cleaning of the household's silver collection. A wealthy Victorian household might have an astonishing quantity of silver, not just cutlery, but serving dishes and tureens, candelabras, tea services, in tray dishes, sauce boats, salt cellars, sugar casters, fish slices, butter dishes, and card trays. All of it had to gleam. All of it had to be without spot or fingerprint. Any item that was not in use would be wrapped in felt or baize and stored in specially made wooden cases in the silver safe, but these too had to be inspected regularly. The process of silver cleaning was laborious and precise. The butler, or more usually, a footman working under his supervision, would first wash the silver in warm water to remove any food residue. Then he would apply a paste made of whiting powder and water, spreading it carefully over the surface, allowing it to dry slightly, and then buffing it off with a soft leather chamois until the silver shone like a mirror. Every piece, every curve and every engraved crest, every handle and every rim. It was work that required patience and steady hands. Done wrong, it could scratch the silver. Done carelessly, it left streaks or cloudy patches that the butler would notice immediately. Done correctly, it produced a gleam so perfect that you could see your own reflection in the bowl of a soup spoon. While the silver received its daily attention, the housemaids were engaged in their own, equally exacting routines. The floors required sweeping, but in the Victorian era, before vacuum cleaners existed, sweeping was a rather elaborate operation. Wet tea leaves were scattered across the carpet before sweeping began. This was a practical technique used to prevent dust from rising into the air. The leaves were heavy enough to weigh down the dust and carry it along as the brush moved. The servant would then sweep methodically, working her way across the room in overlapping strokes, gathering everything toward the center or toward the door. Carpet sweeping was followed by carpet beating when the season demanded it, taking the rugs outside to a line or frame and striking them repeatedly with a flat wicker beater to drive out the deep-seated dust that ordinary sweeping could not reach. This was exhausting work, and the clouds of dust that emerged from even the cleanest-looking rug could be startling. In the kitchen, breakfast was taking shape. The Victorian upper-class breakfast was not a light affair. On a typical morning, a family might expect a porridge to start, served with cream. Then perhaps deviled kidneys, which were lamb or veal kidneys split open, seasoned with cayenne and mustard, and cooked quickly in butter over a fierce heat. Kedgeree, that wonderfully fragrant mixture of flaked smoked haddock, rice, hard-boiled eggs, and butter, brightened with curry powder, was another popular option. Cold meats were always on the sideboard: sliced ham, cold chicken, perhaps tongue. Toast was served in a silver toast rack, always in a rack, never directly on a plate, because a rack allowed the steam to escape and kept the toast from going limp. Marmalade, butter in a crystal dish, a silver coffee pot, a silver teapot. The cook had been producing all of this since before dawn. The footman carried it all upstairs on trays, arranged it on the sideboard in the dining room, and then stood quietly in attendance while the family served themselves from the dishes, refilling coffee cups, removing finished plates, and managing the flow of the meal with a practiced, nearly invisible efficiency. After breakfast came the clearing. Every dish returned below stairs to be washed. The washing up itself was the province of the scullery maid, working at a stone sink with water heated on the range. Then the dishes were dried and stacked, the kitchen cleaned, and the preparations for the next meal began almost immediately. The Victorian household did not pause. The middle hours of the day brought no rest, but they did bring a kind of rhythm, a quieter, more methodical continuation of the morning's work. Laundry was, in many Victorian households, a weekly operation conducted on a scale that modern people find almost incomprehensible. A large house might produce many dozens of items of laundry in a single week sheets. pillowcases, table linens, napkins, towels, uniforms, personal clothing, collars, cuffs, aprons, and the endless variety of undergarments that Victorian modesty required. In households large enough to have their own laundry facilities, a wash house, usually a separate building near the servants' quarters, Monday was laundry day. The wash house contained a copper, a large metal vat set over a furnace in which water was heated until boiling. The laundry maid or under housemaid would sort the linens first by type and color, then soak them in cold water, then transfer them to the copper for boiling with soap. The boiling removed grease and stains, but required the items to be stirred regularly with a long wooden stick in clouds of hot steam that filled the wash house from floor to ceiling. After boiling, the linens were removed with the stick and transferred to a wooden tub for rinsing first in warm water, then again in cooler water, with a small amount of blue added to the final rinse to brighten the whites. Then wringing by hand, which was brutal on the arms and wrists, or through a mangle, a large device with 2 rollers turned by a handle that squeezed the water from the fabric as it passed through. Then hanging. Sheets were heavy when wet. Carrying them out to the drying ground, or, in wet weather, arranging them on racks near the kitchen range required strength and stamina. And the ironing that followed the drying was an operation requiring skill, patience, and careful temperature management, using flat irons heated on the range and tested with a damp finger before use. This was a day's work. A full day's work for at least 2 people. In houses that sent laundry out to a commercial laundress, as many town houses did, Monday was somewhat quieter. But the work found other channels. The brass needed attending to. Victorian houses contained brass in remarkable quantities: door handles, keyhole plates, fireplace fenders, coal scuttles, stair rods, lamp fittings, knockers, letter boxes, and the flat surfaces of the stair rods that held the carpet in place on every step. All of it had to be polished. All of it had a tendency to tarnish, to develop a dull brown oxidation that obscured the warm golden gleam beneath. The housemaid would apply a proprietary paste brands like Brasso, which actually dates from 1905, or earlier homemade preparations of salt and vinegar, and rub the brass vigorously in small circular motions with a piece of soft cloth. The tarnish would come away onto the cloth. The brass would begin to glow. She would buff it to a high shine and move on to the next item. The stair rods were particularly tedious. There was one under each step of the main staircase, perhaps 20, 30 more in a very large house, each one requiring removal, polishing, and replacement. It was work that produced results so slowly and required so much time that it was not unusual for a housemaid to clean the stair rods on a rotation, doing 5 or 6 one day and the same number on the following day, so that the task was ongoing but never quite completed. This is, perhaps, one of the most defining qualities of servant work in the Victorian era. It was never done. The fires burned down and needed relaying. The silver tarnished and needed polishing. The brass dulled and needed buffing. The carpets collected dust and needed beating. The kitchen floor absorbed grease and needed scrubbing. Every task completed led directly to the same task being needed again, in a cycle without beginning or end. If this sounds like it would drive a person to despair, consider that many servants described this repetition not as torture, but simply as the texture of their days, as natural and unremarkable as breathing. They had grown up in households where this kind of labor was simply what life was. They had been trained from an early age not to expect variety or novelty from their working hours. The work was the work. It was done properly or it was done poorly. Done properly, there was a satisfaction in it that was real, even if it was quiet. Let the rhythm of it settle over you. The same strokes of the cloth, the same brightening of the metal, the same small satisfaction, repeated. The afternoon brought a shift in the quality of the day's work. While mornings were defined by the urgent, noisy business of getting the house functional fires laid, breakfast produced, floors swept, afternoons had a quieter character. The family was often out during the afternoon, paying calls, riding, attending to business, shopping, walking in the park. The house, for a few hours, became a more peaceful place. This was the time for the deeper, slower work. The bedrooms needed to be done. After the family had risen and dressed and gone downstairs, the housemaids were permitted to move through the upper floors to attend to the sleeping rooms. This was careful, particular work. The bed's first sheets stripped back and aired, pillows plumped and turned, the mattress checked and freshened. Then the bedclothes replaced in the correct order, under sheets first, then top sheets with their hospital corners, then blankets. Then the counterpane or bedspread smoothed to absolute precision without a single crease. The fire in the bedroom, if there was one, and in the grander bedrooms there usually was, would be checked and replenished. Coal brought up in a scuttle and laid quietly against the grate. Then the washing stand. The jug and basin from the morning's washing emptied, rinsed, and replaced with clean cold water. The soap dish refreshed. The towels changed for fresh ones, folded neatly in exactly the way that the household's custom dictated. The chamber pot, if still in use in older-fashioned households, not yet fully converted to modern plumbing, dealt with discreetly and cleaned. The dressing table in the mistress's room required particular attention. The lady's maid would normally attend to her mistress's personal items, the silver backed brushes and mirrors, the perfume bottles and powder boxes, but the housemaid was responsible for the surface itself, dusted, polished, and in order. Nothing moved, nothing replaced in a different position, nothing disturbed. A lady noticed if her things had been touched. The floors in the bedrooms needed sweeping, just as those below had been swept in the morning. And in the corridors and on the landings, the floor polish needed regular application, rubbing the wood or tiles with a wax preparation and buffing it with a soft cloth until it gleamed like a mirror underfoot. Down in the kitchen, the afternoon brought preparations for dinner, beginning in earnest. The Victorian dinner was the social centerpiece of the day, not the quick, informal meal we might imagine, but a formal, multi-course affair that could last 2 hours or more, requiring as many as 8, 10, or 12 dishes to be prepared and served in sequence. Soup, an entree, a joint of meat or a roast. A second meat course, removes a dish that replaced the soup or fish. Vegetables, a savory, 2, 3, or more desserts. Ices, fruit. Each course was cooked to order, served in exact sequence, removed without fuss, and followed seamlessly by the next. The cook orchestrated this from her range, timing each element with the precision of a conductor. The kitchen maid prepared the vegetables, the sauces, the simpler elements. The scullery maid washed everything as it was used, maintaining a constant flow of clean pots and pans back to the cook. Upstairs, the footman set the dining table in the afternoon. This was an art in itself. The white tablecloth, freshly laundered and ironed to perfect smoothness, was laid first, followed by a series of underlinings to protect it and provide the right weight and drape. Then the plates, placed with mechanical precision at equal distances. The cutlery, and in a formal Victorian place setting, there might be 6, 8, 10 pieces of cutlery for a single diner aligned to exact angles using a ruler in some very precise households. The glasses different shapes for water, white wine, red wine, champagne, perhaps port and sherry. The table decorations candelabra, floral centerpieces, small dishes of nuts and sweets placed at intervals. The place cards, written in copperplate and arranged with great care. All of this before the family came down to dress for dinner. By 6 in the evening, the house had shifted register entirely. The family was upstairs dressing for dinner, a ritual that in wealthy households was elaborate enough to be a performance in itself. The valet assisted the master with his white tie and tails, the stiff-fronted shirt, the waistcoat, the perfectly folded pocket square. The lady's maid dressed her mistress, the evening gown with its hooks and buttons, the corsetting if she still wore it, the hair arranged with pins and combs, and perhaps heated tongs into the fashionable shape of the moment, the jewelry selected and laid out for inspection. Below stairs, the kitchen was at its most intense. The range burned hot. The cook moved between burners with a kind of focused urgency, tasting, adjusting, timing. The kitchen maid ran between the cook and the oven, the larder and the pastry table. The scullery maid worked at her sink in a state of near continuous motion. The smell of roasting meat and caramelizing onions and rich stocks reducing on the back of the stove filled every corner of the lower floor. At the appointed hour 7:30 or 8, or sometimes later in the grandest houses, the butler would make his way to the dining room to inspect it one final time. His eye was trained to catch the tiniest imperfection, a glass that was not quite centered, a fork that was not quite level, a candle that needed straightening. He would make any small adjustments required with quiet, unhurried efficiency. Then he would go to the drawing room, where the family had gathered for pre-dinner drinks, and announce dinner is served. The meal itself was served by the footman under the butler's supervision. Each footman knew his position at the table, knew which guests he was responsible for, knew the order of service from the right for certain dishes, from the left for others, and executed it with the smooth, practiced efficiency that comes only from hundreds of repetitions. The butler poured wine, moving around the table with unhurried precision, replenishing glasses at exactly the right moment, never interrupting conversation, never drawing attention to himself. He was present and absent simultaneously there when needed, invisible otherwise. This quality of invisible presence was the highest expression of the butler's art. A formal Victorian dinner could last from 8 in the evening until 10 or 10:30. For the servants, this meant hours of standing, carrying, moving quietly back and forth between the kitchen below and the dining room above, with no rest and no food until the family finally rose from the table and moved to the drawing room for their after-dinner coffee and conversation. Then the clearing began. Every plate, every glass, every piece of cutlery had to be carried below stairs, washed, dried, and returned to its proper place. The tablecloth had to be removed and folded for the laundry. The table had to be brushed clear of crumbs. The candles, those that had not burned down, had to be extinguished and removed. While the footman managed the dining room, the butler began the evening's silver inspection. Every piece that had been used must be checked, cleaned of any marks, and properly put away before he could retire. This was not a quick task. In the kitchen, the scullery maid was still working. She would be the last person working in the kitchen most nights, washing the final pots and pans in cold water by lamplight, scrubbing the range with black lead for the morning, sweeping the kitchen floor, and checking that all the fires were made safe. She might not finish before 11 at night. Sometimes later. She would be back at her work by 5 in the morning. This is important to understand. The day I have just described to you was not exceptional. It was not unusual. It was Tuesday. It was Thursday. It was every day of the week, with small variations. It was the life. A servant's time was almost entirely the property of their employer. This was not a metaphor. It was a legal and practical reality of Victorian domestic service. When a servant accepted a position, they accepted a set of conditions that governed not only their working hours, but their sleeping arrangements, their dress, their diet, their social lives, and in many cases, even their relationships. Time off was limited. In most Victorian households, servants were entitled to 1/2 day off per week, typically a Sunday afternoon, from after the midday meal until 9 or 10 in the evening. Every other hour of every other day belonged to the household. Some households were more generous, perhaps an evening off each week, in addition to the Sunday half day. Some very old-fashioned households offered less. The conditions varied enormously between establishments, and servants who worked for kind, reasonable employers considered themselves fortunate and stayed. Those who found themselves in unkind or exploitative households often left as soon as they had saved enough to travel. Finding a new position required a character, a written reference from the previous employer, attesting to the servant's honesty, diligence, and good conduct. Without a character, a servant could not be hired by a respectable household. The power this gave employers over their domestic staff was considerable and was sometimes abused. The rules governing servant behavior were, in most households, extensive and specific. Servants were not to be seen by the family, except when performing their duties. This was the golden rule. In a well-run house, a housemaid would step back into a doorway or turn to face the wall if a member of the family came unexpectedly along the corridor. Not out of shame, or not only out of shame, but because the convention of invisible service required it. There were rules about noise: no singing, no running, no raised voices in the upper floors of the house. There were rules about dress, the exact uniform for each role, worn correctly and kept clean at all times, with different uniforms for morning duties and afternoon or evening attendance. There were rules about language. Certain topics were not to be discussed, certain expressions were not to be used. There were rules about visitors. Friends and family could not visit the servant in the house, except in very specific circumstances, usually in the kitchen or the servants' hall, and usually with the housekeeper's permission. Many households prohibited followers, a Victorian euphemism for romantic relationships. A female servant discovered to be in a relationship could be dismissed instantly, without notice, and without a character. The reasoning was partly practical: a pregnant servant could not work, and partly a kind of moralistic paternalism that was deeply embedded in Victorian attitudes toward the working classes. And yet, within these restrictions, a life existed. In the servants' hall, the room where the lower servants ate their meals and spent what little free time they had, there was community, gossip, small dramas of friendship and rivalry, and occasional romance that unfolded over weeks and months and years of shared life. Servants at a large country house might live in closer proximity to one another than many families, sharing meals 3 times a day, sleeping in adjacent attic rooms, spending years together in the same unchanging routine. Friendships formed in service could last a lifetime. So could enmities. On Sunday afternoons, the half-day off, servants might walk into town, visit family if they lived nearby, attend church, or simply walk in the fields around the estate, a particular luxury for those who had come from cramped urban environments. Letters were written home. Small savings were put by for the future. The future for many servants meant eventually leaving service. Young women often left when they married. Young men might work their way up to butler or valet and remain in service for decades, retiring in their 60s with a small pension from a benevolent employer. Others accumulated enough to start a small business, a lodging house, a laundry, a small shop. But for most of the years of their working lives, this was the world, the house, the routine, the fires and the silver and the long quiet days that blurred together into a lifetime of service. Money, in the Victorian servant's life, was a subject of considerable calculation. Wages varied enormously by position, by household, by geography, and by period. But we can trace some general patterns that give a sense of what a servant's financial life actually looked like. At the lower end of the scale, a scullery maid at the beginning of our period, the 1870s and 1880s, might earn as little as £4 to £6 per year. To give that some context, a pound in 1880 was worth perhaps 70 or 80 modern dollars in purchasing power, though such comparisons are always approximate. £6 was not a great deal of money, but it was, crucially, supplemented by room and board. The servant did not pay for food or shelter, which removed the 2 largest expenses from their budget. A housemaid might earn £8 to £12 per year. A cook in a middle-class household, 14 to 20. A cook in a wealthy household, considerably more. A good cook was prized, and wages for this position could reach £30 or £40 annually in the grandest establishments. A housekeeper commanded salaries that might range from £2,500 to £50 or even £60 per year, plus various perquisites, the right to sell empty bottles, the right to tips from tradespeople, a small allowance for tea and sugar. Butlers occupied a similar range, with the additional benefit in some households of a percentage on the wine cellar purchases, an incentive system that occasionally led to creative bookkeeping. Ladies' maids and valets, working in intimate proximity to wealthy individuals, often received considerably more than their formal wages would suggest gifts of clothing, gifts of money, legacies in their employers' wills, and in some cases the employment of family members. The relationship between a personal servant and a long-serving employer could develop into something that, while never quite equal, was considerably warmer than simple transaction. Wages were typically paid quarterly at Lady Day, Midsummer, Michaelmas, and Christmas. A servant who left before a quarter was complete might forfeit the wages for that quarter, another mechanism that bound them to the household. It was a system that, measured by modern standards, extracted an enormous amount of labor for a very modest financial return. And yet it was also a system that provided security, housing, meals, and in kinder households a form of family life to young people who had often left their own families at 14 or 15 to go into service. Whether it was exploitative, protective, or simply the texture of a world that operated by entirely different assumptions than our own, is a question worth sitting with. By the first years of the 20th century, the world we have been describing was beginning, very slowly, to change. The Edwardian period, the years of Edward VII reign, from 1901 to 1910, and the years immediately following until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, was in many ways the high point of the great household. The great country houses of England had never been grander or more fully staffed. The season, that sequence of social events, balls, house parties, shooting weekends, and presentations at court that structured the lives of the English upper class, had never been more elaborate. And yet the cracks were beginning to show. The number of young people willing to enter domestic service was declining, slowly but perceptibly. Other forms of employment were becoming available: factories, shops, offices, the expanding commercial world of the Edwardian city. A position in a draper's shop was harder and more exhausting than many people imagined, and paid little better than service. But it came without the restrictions on personal freedom, without the requirement to wear a uniform, without the constant surveillance of a housekeeper. Young women were beginning to compare their options and choose accordingly. Technology was beginning to intrude in gentle ways. Gas lighting, which had been present in wealthy urban houses since the middle of the Victorian period, reduced somewhat the burden of oil lamps and candles. Early electrical installations were appearing in the grandest houses. The telephone arrived. Mechanical carpet sweepers early. Hand-pushed vacuum devices began to appear in domestic catalogs. None of this eliminated the labor of the household, but it began to suggest that some of it might one day be mechanized. Then came 1914. The First World War transformed British society in ways that the preceding 50 years had not. Young men went into the armed forces. Young women went into factories, offices, hospitals, munitions works. The labor pool that had sustained domestic service for generations found other, better paid, less restricted work, and did not fully return when the war ended. The great households shrank. Families who had employed 20 servants employed 10. Those who had employed 10 managed with 5 or 6. The scullery maid was replaced, gradually, by plumbing and later by machines. The kitchen maid was replaced by labor-saving appliances. The housemaid's endless rounds of fire laying became unnecessary as central heating appeared. The laundrymaid was replaced by commercial laundries and eventually by washing machines. The world we have been moving through tonight, that precise, hierarchical, exhausting, quietly human world below stairs, did not vanish overnight. It faded. Over the decades between the wars and after the Second World War, it diminished generation by generation until by the mid-20th century it had become memory, and then history. But it had been real. It had been the daily reality for hundreds of thousands of people across Britain and across the English-speaking world. The labor was real. The cold mornings were real. The graphite on the hands, the weight of the coal scuttle, the sound of the silver being polished in the early hours, all of it was real. And it is right that we remember it. It is late now. The house is quiet. Upstairs, the family is asleep as they have been for hours, warm in their feather beds, their dreams untouched by any thought of the fires that were laid for them, or the silver that gleams in the locked pantry, or the floors that will be spotless when they come down in the morning. Below stairs, the last servant has finally set down her cloth. The kitchen range ticks and settles as it cools. A cat has found a warm spot near the hearth. The servants' hall is empty, chairs pushed back from the long table, where the day's meals were eaten in their hierarchy, and their order, and their quiet. Someone's alarm clock is already set for 4:30. Tomorrow, it will begin again. The same fires, the same silver, the same cool corridors traversed in the gray pre-dawn, with a candle in one hand and a kneeling mat tucked under the other arm. There is something almost meditative about it, if you sit with it long enough. The repetition that might have felt like monotony reveals itself, in this quiet moment, as something else, a kind of mastery, a deep familiarity with the material world, a knowledge of how things are maintained and cared for, that has been nearly lost in our own era of convenience and replacement. These were people who knew how to tend to things, who understood that silver left unpolished will tarnish, that fires untended will go out, that a house neglected will simply stop working, who brought to each small daily task a kind of professional pride, quiet, unrewarded by applause or recognition, but real. They lived lives of extraordinary ordinariness, and in that ordinariness there was dignity. Let the house settle around you now. Let the sounds of that distant kitchen, the soft rhythms of work, the creak of floorboards, the gentle hiss of the range carry you down into sleep. You are warm. You are still. The fires are burning. Good night.